It starts with a birthday, because tragedies often hide inside ordinary dates. June 1994. A phone rings. A mother wants to hear her son's voice, just for a minute. She's told he's too unwell to speak. His name is Julian Webb. He is 31. By the end of that night, he is dead. In a quiet house in Yapton, West Sussex, the world narrows to two people and one story. Julian's wife, Dena Thompson, says he took his own life. No street witness, no dramatic scene, just a private death and a simple explanation offered quickly. But some stories don't sit right. They scrape, they snag, they leave a small, sharp discomfort you can't swallow. Julian's mother feels it immediately. She doesn't have proof. She has instinct and the weight of knowing her child. She refuses to stop asking questions. In the first hours after Julian dies, something else begins to move: money. Reports later describe Dena trying to claim around £35,000 from his work pension within a day. Whether you call it shock or calculation, the timing hits Julian's family like a cold draft. Grief, to them, doesn't look like an urgent chase for payouts. Then comes the word that changes the temperature in the room: cremation. Dena wants Julian cremated. Cremation can be normal, loving, cultural. In a death with questions, cremation is also final. Ash can't be tested later. Ash can't argue with a story. Julian's family resists. They insist on burial. That choice, burial instead of cremation, doesn't feel like a plot twist in the moment. It feels like a family trying to keep hold of dignity, but it becomes the hinge of everything. Because when truth arrives years late, it needs one thing more than emotion. A body in the ground can still speak. An inquest follows, and the result is not an answer. It's an open verdict. Not suicide, not murder, official uncertainty. To outsiders, that can sound like closure. To a mother, it sounds like a door left ajar in a storm. Everything still rattling, nothing safe. The question remains: what happened to him? Poisoning cases live inside that kind of uncertainty. They don't need noise. They don't need a weapon you can point to. They can look like illness, like despair, like a person fading in a bed while someone else controls the explanation. If the story is suicide, people stop looking for an outside hand. That's not conspiracy. That's psychology. Years later, prosecutors would argue a detail from Julian's everyday life was used against him. He liked very hot curry, heat that can mask bitterness, a strong flavor that can hide what doesn't belong. It's intimate, domestic, almost cruelly ordinary. The kind of thing you'd never suspect could be turned into a weapon. In 1994, Dena Thompson isn't a convicted killer in this file. She is a grieving spouse with a plausible story, a private death behind a closed door. That's the advantage in cases like this. The world is reluctant to interrogate grief, to suspect a spouse, to complicate an explanation that already feels painful. Julian's mother pushes anyway. She pushes through social pressure, through being seen as unable to accept it, through the quiet suggestion that she's making things worse. But sometimes the only reason a case survives is because a family refuses to let it die politely. The years move. The file sits in that uncomfortable middle space. No conviction, no clean conclusion, just suspicion that can't crystallize. This is the part most people don't understand: how easy it is for uncertainty to become permanent. Not because the truth isn't there, but because the system needs more than belief. It needs a trigger. That trigger arrives later, through a different courtroom. In 2000, Dena faces trial for allegedly trying to kill her third husband, Richard Thompson. She is acquitted. The attention matters, because once a person is in the spotlight for one alleged act, old questions around them stop fading. They get louder. They get reread. Then, in reporting about the renewed investigation, a witness enters the story. Someone who offers information that helps police justify reopening Julian's case. This is the moment suspicion gains traction, because the case finally has a pathway the system recognizes, something that can be followed, tested, corroborated. And when a death is old, and the story is contested, and the body is still there. The next step is the most haunting word in the file: exhumation. It's not cinematic, it's clinical and heavy and sad. It is the state asking the earth to return what it was holding, because the living aren't giving answers. Julian Webb's body is exhumed in 2001, according to reporting. Remember the cremation request now. Remember the family insisting on burial. This is the reason that refusal matters. Without a body, there is no second chance. With a body, science can argue with the first conclusion. Time can be challenged. The allegation that emerges in court reporting is chilling in its simplicity. An overdose involving the antidepressant daptopin with ground aspirin also used, concealed in food and drink. No shadowy poison vial, no theatrical toxin. Everyday medication turned into a tool. Poisoning is a crime that borrows the appearance of nature. It can mimic illness, depression, accident, or choice. It can also exploit trust, because a meal is intimate, a drink is casual, a spouse is supposed to be safe. If the prosecution's story is right, then the murder weapon here wasn't only chemistry. It was the assumption that home equals protection. Motive is where this case tightens. Reporting described Dena living a double life, including being married to her first husband when she married Julian. Exposure becomes a kind of cliff edge, because if a lie collapses, everything collapses with it. Status, money, identity. For someone built on deception, exposure doesn't feel like embarrassment. It feels like extinction. The pension claim and the cremation push sit inside that same frame. Money sought fast, evidence urged to disappear. Again, any single detail can be argued away. Grief can make people act strangely. Paperwork can be practical. But patterns are not built from single moments. Patterns are built from repetition, pressure, and a consistent direction of travel toward control. By 2003, the case reaches the Old Bailey. The past is reconstructed, not relived. Witnesses remember through years of distortion. Documents carry more weight than memory. The body's tests become the anchor. This is where the story stops being a family's refusal and becomes a state's accusation, tested under oath. The prosecution case, as reported at the time, argues that drugs were concealed in a very hot curry and that drinks were laced. They argue it was staged as suicide. The defense denies murder. The jury is asked to choose a private tragedy explained by self-harm or a private murder explained by manipulation. This is where reasonable doubt becomes the battlefield. If you want immersion, imagine the jury hearing how a normal meal becomes suspicious only in hindsight. Imagine how a story hardens when a body is exhumed, when a file is reopened, when an open verdict is no longer enough. The courtroom isn't just deciding what happened, it's deciding what kind of story the evidence can support beyond doubt. In December 2003, Dena Thompson is convicted of Julian Webb's murder and jailed for life. A verdict lands like a stone dropped into deep water. It doesn't undo the years. It changes what those years mean. For Julian's mother, it isn't a happy ending. It's an ending that arrives late, after too much waiting, after too much being told to accept uncertainty. After conviction, reporting described her history of fraud and deception involving partners. That matters because it gives shape to behavior the jury heard about: fast money, focus, controlled narratives, strategic relationships. This isn't about villainizing for entertainment. It's about understanding how crimes like this can be built on the same skills used in everyday manipulation. The case is solved, but the questions don't vanish. They shift. How close did this come to being erased permanently? One cremation, and the future has no exhumation. One file closed, and the open verdict becomes the final record. The frightening part is not only what allegedly happened, it's how easily the truth could have become unknowable. And then the story opens again years later, because life in law is not always life in prison. Minimum terms exist, reviews exist, systems evolve. In 2022, the parole board decides she can be released on parole once suitable accommodation is available. And coverage notes her minimum term had been increased to 16 years. Parole is where emotion fights policy. A sentence looks backward. Parole looks forward. It asks whether a person can be managed safely under strict conditions. That question is never comfortable in cases like this, because the public doesn't experience parole as risk management. The public experiences parole as the past walking back into the present. If you want the episode to feel like a story, you end where the story began on that phone call. A mother wanting to hear her son's voice, being told he's too unwell. In real time, it's ordinary. In hindsight, it becomes unbearable, because the simplest moments become evidence of isolation, of narrative control, of a world being kept at arm's length. This is why the Black Widow label is lazy. The real horror isn't a nickname, it's how domestic spaces can be used as stages, how illness can be imitated, how suicide can be suggested as an explanation that discourages questions, and how a family can be pressured to accept it simply because nobody wants to speak the darker possibility out loud. The central object in this case isn't the curry, it's the cremation request. The attempt to close the future's mouth. The family's refusal is what keeps the future possible. Burial becomes not only grief, but preservation. In this story, burial is the reason truth has a second chance. There is also a broader question that hangs over the file like a shadow. How many open verdicts are honest uncertainty, and how many are the product of limited tools at the time? When science cannot read what happened, we cannot say becomes the official line. But official lines can become permanent truths unless someone forces the question back onto the table. That someone is often not police, it's family. And families pay for persistence. They lose peace, they lose time, they get labeled difficult, they get treated like obstacles. Yet sometimes, persistence is the only bridge between a suspicious death and a reopened file. The system is designed to close. Families are designed to remember. The exhumation is where the past becomes physical again. It is a moment of grief, and it is also, in cases like this, a moment of scientific humility. The admission that the first reading might have been wrong, incomplete, or not possible. It is the state saying, we need to ask the body again. The trial is where everything becomes language. Toxicology, results, motives, timelines, behavior, money, pressure. Because juries don't convict on vibes. They convict when the picture becomes coherent beyond doubt. Julian's mother lived in a world that kept trying to close a door she believed should stay open. That's what makes this story retain. It isn't the villain, it's the waiting. Waiting is the real punishment in many cold, delayed cases. Then, years later, parole becomes a second argument with time. The public asks whether life meant what it felt like it meant. The system answers with procedure. It's the reality of sentencing frameworks. But in cases involving alleged domestic poisoning and manipulation, public trust is fragile, because the crime itself relied on trust. In suspicious deaths, urgency around cremation should never be brushed off. In uncertain deaths, evidence preservation is mercy to the future. And in cases where suicide is suggested quickly, the system must still do the slow work of doubt. Julian Webb died in June 1994. An inquest recorded an open verdict. His family resisted cremation and insisted on burial. His body was exhumed in 2001. Dena Thompson was tried at the Old Bailey and convicted in 2003, receiving life imprisonment. She was released on parole in 2022. These are the stakes. Decades, not days. A grave that stayed intact, a file that stayed alive, a mother who refused to accept a convenient story as her son's last sentence. In true crime, people ask what solved the case. Here, the answer is not a single detective. It is refusal. Refusal to cremate, refusal to move on, refusal to let uncertainty become final. If you comment on this case, keep it victim first and responsible. No harassment. No turning speculation into fact. The point isn't spectacle. It's understanding how easily truth can be delayed, and how close it can come to being erased entirely. Because sometimes, the most terrifying crimes are the ones built to look like nothing happened at all. Time doesn't solve crimes. Time hides them. What solves them is preservation, persistence, and the moment the past becomes readable again. In this case, the future only got its chance because a family protected the evidence from disappearing.